Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. Welcome to another edition, installment of Radical History, where your brave host, Rob, uh, where I drink and I tell you about history. Today, I am talking about the Darien scheme, which is about Scotland's, we can say failed attempt to start a colony in the New World. I've got some single malt whiskey. You can't see it because of the glare, but it's Clynelish. I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. I actually don't know what Twitch's policies are on alcohol, but nobody rat on me, okay? Anyway, so I'll be talking about the Darien scheme, and I'm very excited about that. And I did entirely too much research, so I hope you're really excited to hear about this because I've got a lot to say. As always, thank you just for showing up. Please, I'm gonna do it. Everybody. Please smash that like button, subscribe, follow, tell your friends, whatever. I have given up on being humble. Life's too short. I like doing this. I like it when people listen to me talk. I like to talk about history. So, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you enjoy it. And we'll see how this goes. But let's begin by talking about Scotland. So our story takes place in the late 17th century, but it begins much, much earlier than that with the death of Elizabeth I of England. Our great queen, Gloriana, died in 1600, and was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and ascended to assumed the throne of both of England and Ireland, already being king of Scotland. So both countries maintained sort of distinct states, but they had one shared monarch. And this was controversial, but mostly fine. Everybody was cool with monarchs having multiple thrones. Here you see a painting of the union of England and Scotland. I believe that the weirdly ripped baby is Scotland, but I don't actually know. Venus and Athena are there blessing this union. And it was mostly fine with James. Obviously, there was a bit of a kerfuffle because James was, of course, a Catholic, and much of England was a Protestant country, having converted to the Anglican Church because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. But people seemed mostly fine with it. It was, as far as these things go, a relatively painless assumption of power. James said of this union, "What God hath conjoined, let no man separate. I am the husband, and the whole isle is my lawful wife. I am the head, and it is my body. I am the shepherd, and it is my flock." I can turn up the volume. Hold on. How's this? Better? I am the shepherd, and it is my flock. I hope, therefore, that no man will think that I, a Christian king under the gospel, should be a polygamist, and husband to two wives. That I, being the head, should have a divided or monstrous body, or that being the shepherd to so fair a flock, should have my flock parted into two. Which is a really weird way to talk about this, but that is how James apparently talked about being the king of two countries. There were concerns in England mostly that English jobs, now that there was a union of the two countries, would be threatened by the poor people from Scotland. English merchants especially also opposed any rights for Scottish traders. They wanted to cut the Scots out of trade altogether and force the Scottish population to buy from English merchants exclusively. This was sort of unofficial at first, but became very official with the Navigation Acts. Now, those of you who took American history education have probably heard something about the Navigation Acts, or the Acts of Trade and Navigation, which were a long series of English laws that regulated ships, shipping, trade, and commerce between other countries, England, and especially its colonies, starting around 1651. This is the origin, or sort of the implementation and enforcement of mercantilism, the economic philosophy that it's bad when other countries make money from you. So all trade needs to be kept within the, between the colony and the metropole, between the mother country. This was the prevailing economic theory for the early part of the modern period, and especially in England. And so Scotland remained nominally independent, but they could not trade as they wished, because that would have been a violation of English trade policy. Now, for the next 100-ish years, a lot of things happened. If you were here for my Enclosure of the Commons lecture, this is when Cromwell kills the king and sets up the Commonwealth. After that, there's the restoration of the monarchy. This is also a time period when most of the monarchs are Scottish kings, so it's an okay time for Scotland. But it is also a difficult time for both Protestants and Catholics in the country, because differing monarchs and religious warfare. The 17th century is a rough time for Great Britain as a whole. But ultimately, it was kind of a problem, because this is an increasingly Protestant nation, and the monarch, James VI, and then later James VII, were Catholics. Now, when James VII of Scotland, James II of England, was restored, it was not, or became king, sorry. It was not a huge concern, because he was somewhat aged, and his heirs were both Protestant daughters. And so, even though it was not preferable to the people of England or Scotland that there be sort of a division between the monarchy and the official state religion of England, it was fine until 1688, when James's wife gave birth to the new Prince of Wales, James Francis Edward, who would, of course, be a Catholic monarch, and then ensure the Catholic monarchy stay in control of England. This was so disruptive that many influential Protestants claimed that the child was illegitimate and had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan. James II was also an unpopular king for a number of reasons. He suspended the Scottish and English parliaments in 1685 and ruled by personal decree. It also happened to coincide with the prosecution of the 7 bishops, which was a perceived assault on the Church of England. They were acquitted on the 30th of June in 1688, which caused public celebrations, which turned into widespread anti-Catholic riots and damaged James's political authority greatly. Warming pan, good question. I think that, now that you've brought it up, I have literally no idea what that means. That is the source that I read. It said that they thought it was smuggled in a warming pan. We will just have to wonder what women were using warming pans for, giving birth in the 1680s. So, you may have heard of something called the Glorious Revolution, and the sort of like cliff notes of this are that James's elder daughter and heir, Mary. Hello, Bogsley88. Tonight we are discussing the Darien scheme, which is about Scottish colonization of the failed Scottish colony in what is now Panama. I'm going to get to that. Sit tight. In 1677, James's elder daughter and heir Mary married her cousin. Don't freak out. It's normal. It happens all the time. Her cousin, the Protestant William of Orange, the Stadtholder of the main provinces of the Dutch Republic, one of the more powerful rulers of the Protestant Netherlands. Now, at the time, Catholic France was under the rule of the glorious Sun King Louis XIV, longest-lived monarch in the history of Europe, immensely powerful. And a lot of the late 17th and early 18th centuries are about making sure that Louis XIV does become even more powerful as he stands to inherit many, many thrones because his family married into a lot of them. He also expelled a lot of French Protestants, Huguenots, you may have heard of them, and made enemies of England, the Protestant Netherlands, and certain German states because of this. In 1686, these Protestant states formed the anti-French League of Augsburg, which had Dutch support. And a key part of the plan of the League of Augsburg was to gain the alliance of the English, especially their Royal Navy, so that they could fight the French. As a part of this, a group of Protestants in England invited the Prince of Orange, William, to basically invade and become King of England. He arrived in November of 1688. A lot of Protestants, including officers in the army, defected and joined William, as well as James's daughter Anne. James, who was he was a coward. He was a really, really awful baby man king. Lost his nerve, even though his army was double the size of William's. Fled the city, threw the Great Seal of the Realm into the River Thames, and then took refuge in France. And so this guy, William III, became king, sort of appointed by Parliament. And in 1689, Parliament decided to depose... Sorry, they declared James, rather than depose him, I apologize, it's different. They declared him that he had abdicated the throne by fleeing and dropping the Great Seal into the Thames, and then the throne was therefore vacant. And they had the authority to fill it, which they did, with technically James's daughter Mary was declared queen and ruled jointly with William and Mary, William III. Additionally, shortly afterwards, the Parliament of Scotland, which was distinct, also declared James to have forfeited the throne, and William III was the monarch of Scotland as well. This is called the Glorious Revolution. There technically was no bloodshed. There's a whole bunch of stuff about this. It means that it's the end of the divine right of kings because Parliament decided that William III could be king, whatever. This is both overrated and underrated. But the point is that William III, William and Mary, were now... Yes, exactly. Thank you, J. Biddy. Fuck you, Hobbes. Fuck to Hobbes. William and Mary were now monarchs of both England, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, I need to make a little detour now, and I want to talk to you about stonks. Specifically, joint stock companies. Joint stock companies. So, the idea of a joint stock company is exactly what it sounds like. The ability to buy stock or a share in a joint venture. A fractional share of a a company or a business or even just a an adventuring commission. The earliest stock companies appear in China in the Tang and Song dynasties. In Europe, their origins are a little bit late, much later actually, but something to do with maybe the Commenda, which was a Spanish and Italian venture where people would buy in, but it was usually just for one expedition. And there were shares traded in some companies in Sweden and in France and Italy as early as the 13th century. But the earliest joint stock company recognized, in England was the Company of Merchant Adventurers to New Lands, chartered in 1553 with 250 shareholders. More importantly, though, the East India Company was granted a royal charter by Elizabeth I on December 31st, 1600, with the intention of establishing trade on the Indian subcontinent. It granted the Honorable East India Company a 15-year monopoly on all English trade in the East Indies. Now, shortly after that, in 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, issued shares that were made tradable on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which you can see here. All these dudes with hats and collars. This is the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The development allowed joint stock companies to attract capital, and it also made it easier for them to dispose of their shares because they could sell them now. And in 1612, it became the first corporation specifically interested in intercontinental trade. It had locked-in capital and limited liability. This is key. Joint stock companies, much as they do today, pay out dividends, to their shareholders by dividing up the profits of the voyage in the proportion of the shares held. This is exactly how corporations work today. There are a lot of fiddly financial and legal bits attached, but this is the same function. This is the origin of stocks, and corporations and the stock market as it functions today. It was largely tied to, you guessed it, folks, colonialism, imperialism, and forced trade. I know this comes as no surprise to you, but still, it's worth knowing. It's also worth knowing that all of these joint stock companies, the successful ones anyway, were granted pure monopolies on trade and military protection from their parent countries, especially the East India Company, which used its power, both financial and legal and military, to crush any upstarts that came against them. So there were attempts by the Danish, the French, and the Prussians to start their own joint stock companies to compete that failed, largely because the East India Company had a lot of imperial support. In fact, in the 1670s, King Charles II granted the East India Company rights to autonomous territorial acquisitions. They could mint their own money. They could build fortresses and troops, form alliances, make war and peace, and exercise both civil and criminal jurisdiction over their acquired areas, basically making the East India Company, and by extension a lot of the other joint stock companies, their own sort of mini states, which isn't terrifying or applicable to anything that's happening today. So back to Scotland. Now, for the most part, Scotland and Scotland's inhabitants were happy with William and Mary and saw opportunity there. But the Highlanders rose in 1689 in the first of many Jacobite uprisings, which they would again and again and again until 1745, and when they were ruthlessly crushed at Culloden. But this time they were also ruthlessly crushed, and in 1689, largely by other Scots, Lowland Scots specifically. The Lowland Scot aristocracy thought they could make nice with William III, and they were mostly right. And William III didn't really want to deal with the Scots because he was busy trying to defend Dutch lands from France and deal with continental affairs. So he rescinded one of the Navigation Acts and allowed for companies to be formed in Scotland for foreign trade, which was a new change. It had not been really allowed before then. Scotland saw an opportunity to improve their fortunes and avoid trade with England entirely by sort of going around and forming their own companies. Now, the reason why they needed to do this is because Scotland was kind of having a rough go of things. This is the middle of what is called the 7 Ill Years, which was a period of famine, economic depression, and just general malaise in Scotland. There were problems with French protectionism, reducing the overall profitability of Scottish exports. The Scottish cattle trade became less profitable, and there were 4 years of extremely bad harvests, 1695, 96, and 98, 99. The 1690s were also Scotland's coldest decade in 750 years, possibly driven by multiple volcanic eruptions in Indonesia and elsewhere. During this period, anywhere between 5 and 15% of the Scottish population was killed. Areas such as Aberdeenshire, though, saw death rates as high as 25%. The Old Scottish Poor Law, which provided for the poor, was overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis because in the countryside where the majority of the population lived, it relied on funds raised and distributed by the Kirk, usually led by a parish minister, and reliant on local landholders, particularly the lairds. And so everybody was having a rough time. And throughout the 1600s, Scotland had made attempts to improve their economic fortunes by competing with England at fishing and production of cloth, because these were the only ways to make money, apparently, in the 1600s, and repeatedly failed. These ventures were just catastrophic again and again and again. Interestingly, though, following the Glorious Revolution, there was a huge boom in the creation of new industries, driven partly by better legal protections under William III, but there was also an influx of Huguenots expelled by France, which helped with a labor shortage. However, a lot of these new ventures, which had been sort of like textile related, completely stopped. There was basically a cessation of any new companies being created in 1696 because almost all available Scottish capital was now going to exactly one place. There we go. The Company of Scotland Trading to Africa and the Indies, also called the Scottish Darien Company, which was a overseas trading company created by an Act of Parliament of Scotland in 1695. The Act granted the company a monopoly of Scottish trade to India, Africa, and the Americas, which was similar to what English charter companies had, and extraordinary sovereign rights, and 21 years of exemptions from taxation. This was a particular concern to the English, who worried it would be used to smuggle goods in through Scotland, which would have been smarter than what they actually did. But anyway, don't worry about that. Now, this made a certain degree of sense. England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and even the Danes had New World possessions. And so Scotland, trying to make a name for itself on the international stage, said, well, what we need is a New World possession. The company had, like I said, extraordinary sovereign rights. It could hire ships, arm them, sail from anywhere in Scotland, and trade anywhere in Asia, Africa, or America. It could also build fortifications, make treaties with foreign governments as needed. The monopoly on trade was absolute for 31 years. Nobody could trade with foreign entities aside from the company. There were also provisions for legal and military protections from the English crown if they should happen to end up on the wrong side of anyone's guns. Theoretically, according to the charter of the company, if they were attacked by a foreign power, the English would have to defend them. In practice, it was not clear if this would ever happen, but that was the legal theory. This was met with immediate legal and financial challenges from the East India Company, which had substantial influence in Parliament. And by substantial, I mean it basically had dozens of bought and sold members of parliament. What the EIC wanted, it tended to get. The founders, half of whom were English, of the Darien Company, the Scottish Darien Company, were English, and they had initially intended to raise funds on the continent from Germany and from the Netherlands, but they were prohibited from doing so by the EIC. And then again, they were hoping to raise funds from both Scotland and London, but again, were prohibited by the EIC. And so they were forced to do so exclusively in Scotland. Subscriptions were taken, which was where you just sort of like went around to people and were like, here, you can buy a share for this much. And they raised £400,000 sterling, which is about $105 million in today money, though the company could only call up for financing the expedition, outfitting the ships, $45 million, £170,000 sterling. By comparison, the EIC had a working capital of around £1.5 million sterling, or $400 million, and even the amount raised that they could cobble together was actually less or more than what Scotland had on hand. So a bunch of that was raised on credit. And many Scots went into substantial debt to finance this expedition, finance the Darien Company. I've read differing reports, but there are estimates that this was between 1/5 and a half of all available Scottish capital, all available Scottish wealth. In either case, or in any case, it was a lot. It was a substantial portion of Scotland's wealth. And the man behind this venture, largely, was a man named William Paterson, who was a Scotsman, who was also the co-founder of the Bank of England. And if you were around for my talk on the Bank of England, which I believe has now been lost to history because I failed to download it from Twitch, I talked about how significant the implications of the founding of the Bank of England were. But he was one of the... this was partially his brainchild, and he wanted to do something similar in Scotland. And early in his life, he had emigrated to the Bahamas, where he got the idea for the Darien scheme. He had this idea, William Paterson did, to create a port on the Isthmus of America, in what is now Panama, a free port to facilitate trade between Europe and the Indies. He called it an entrepot for the exchange of Western and Eastern commodities. Now, he had pitched this idea all over Europe, in Germany, in France, in Italy, and while everybody was interested in the idea, nobody was willing to put down money to make it happen. And so it was ultimately necessary for him to go back to Scotland and say, look, let's do this. Unfortunately, one of Paterson's subordinates embezzled money from the company prior to the launching of the expedition, and he fell out of favor. So when the expedition launched, Paterson was a part of it, but he was not really in charge. And this had a substantial impact on the outcome of things. But let's talk for a moment about Darien. Now, Darien, and I'm actually probably saying this wrong because it is a name that originates from a language spoken by the Cueva, which was an indigenous tribe that was destroyed by the conquistadors in the 16th century. And it refers to, where's my image? Refers to, this area that you see here on the skinny part of Panama, the Darien Gap, the Isthmus of Darien, which is a pretty inhospitable place. It is mostly mountainous rainforest, and where it is not, it is mosquito-infested swamp. For the purposes of Scotland's attempt to settle, it's also worth noticing that this is technically owned by Spain and not very far from the ports where a lot of the silver from Paterson and elsewhere in South America was sent back to Europe. Now, a lot has been made about the poor decision to settle here, but it actually wasn't as bad as later histories have made it out to be. The distance to the other side of the isthmus is actually not that far, just 50 or 60 miles. There is fresh water here. There is a sheltered harbor, but it is still one of the more challenging places to settle in the New World, especially for disease-prone Scots folk. But that did not stop the Scots from putting together a glorious expedition of 1,200 volunteers and 5 ships, the St. Andrew, the Unicorn, the Caledonia, the Endeavour, and the Dolphin. And this was led by mostly former officers and soldiers. And many of them knew each other from the army, and a few of them were notorious for being involved in the massacre of Glencoe at the end of the Jacobite Rising of 1689, where men of Clan MacDonald were trapped and murdered to make an example to unruly Highland Scots. This group of officers appeared to be, to a lot of people, kind of a clique, and it caused a lot of suspicion among other members of the expedition. They were not trusted and were difficult to work with and didn't work very well with other people, the settlers especially, that were on their way to Darien. But they had high hopes for this expedition, and they set out from Leith. And this is weird. Leith is at the mouth of the Firth of Forth, but it's on the east side of Scotland, so they had to sail around Scotland, and a lot of the people on board said this was by far the worst part of the voyage. Not a great start, but people were feeling very optimistic, and one person who had invested in the venture, a man named Alexander Pennacook, a Scottish physician and poet, wrote a poem celebrating the affair called Caledonia Triumphans. And this is part of it. Our claim is just, and so we value not the brags of Spain nor thunderings of the Pope, who may well threaten, yet don't dare fight. When he minds Darien and old 88, their cruelties were Catholic indeed, not Christian, to poor Indians and their seed, but those they call heretics of our nation, we hope will show a meeker reformation. Nor shall insulting neighbours henceforth taunt the generous Scots for poverty and want. Our ships through all the world shall go and come, even from the rising to the setting sun. Then shall we from genuine spring command what now we truckle at a second hand, and we shall flourish by your royal rays with honour, riches, and old Nestor's days, and ever bless our God and praise our King, and Caledonia's triumphs gladly sing. It is worth noting this came out before Alexander Pennacook had any idea what happened in Darien, but I just want you to know how excited everybody in Scotland was for this venture. Everyone had very, very high hopes. There'll be more poetry at the end, don't worry. So they reached their destination on November 2nd, 1698. They found a harbor off the coast of Darien, east of Golden Island in Caledonia Bay, which and they called this settlement New Edinburgh. And it was not a bad place. Like I said, it was a large sheltered harbor. There was a supply of fresh water. They could see from the end of the peninsula any approaching ships. They built and armed a fort they called Fort St. Andrew, which looked out over the bay. And they made contact with the local indigenous Americans, the Guna, who called themselves the Tule. They're still there, who hated the Spanish and were more than happy to work with the Scots. But unfortunately, that is the end of their good decision-making. The settlers planted some crops, but nowhere near enough, and they didn't grow very well. And they thought they could trade. They had brought a bunch of mirrors and combs and other trinkets, which they thought they could trade to the natives or to passing ships. But the natives were not super interested, and they failed to trade with any of the ships that came by. A lot of the Scots went hungry and fell sick. They suffered from malaria and other diseases, something called the bloody flux, which is a horrible form of diarrhea, possibly dysentery. The natives brought them fruit and plantains because they saw that they were starving, but they were appropriated by the leaders and the sailors, who mostly remained on the ships. The settlers did manage to hunt some giant turtles, but they were largely too sick to really do any serious hunting. And on top of all of this, the food that they did manage to have to save was spoiled by failure to stow it properly. It sounds like there was a lot of interpersonal grievance, a lot of mismanagement, and a lot of just general bad decision making made by the leadership. But on top of all of this, what was even worse was that King William forbade any English colonies, especially Jamaica, from helping the settlers, since he didn't really want to. He was worried about offending Spain, so he forbade them from talking to or providing any aid to the Darien colonists. And so not only did they not receive even so much as a barrel of fresh water, but they weren't even able to send messages back and forth to Scotland. And so the home country had no idea how the Darien venture was going, and they were unable to get support. After just 8 months, when around 10 to 15 Scots were dying every single day, the colony was abandoned in July 1699, except for 6 men who were too weak to move. They boarded on the ships that remained, only 300 of the original 1,200 settlers, and then tried to head to Port Royal, but were refused again because the king didn't want them to offend the Spanish. And then they went on to New York, baby, where they landed in August, the Caledonia first, and then later the Unicorn. And one historian wrote this about the whole venture. Thus it came to pass that Caledonia was forsaken, and the vast expenses hitherto bestowed upon that design were mostly lost and came to nothing. And this desertion did lay the ground of the miscarrying and defeating of whatever following recruits and supplies the Company of Scotland sent unto this place. So great is the uncertain vanity of all human affairs, and the most promising like designs of the children of men. Sic transit gloria mundi. So passes the glory of the world. However, because communication was cut off, a second expedition was launched without knowing the fate of the first. 4 ships sailed on the 24th of September, 1699, with 1,300 more volunteers and substantial supplies to restore and resupply the Darien colony, and they revived in November of 1699, rebuilt Fort Andrew, and waited for a Spanish attack, which did come, unfortunately, in early of 1700. The Spanish laid siege to Fort Andrew for a month, during which many on both sides died again of fever, especially malaria. The Spanish commander called for the Scots to surrender and avoided having to do a final, violent assault. And after negotiations, the Scots were allowed to leave with just their guns, and the colony was abandoned for the last time. Only a handful of those from the second expedition ever returned to Scotland. Of the total 2,500 settlers that had set off, just a few hundred survived, and just one vessel, the Caledonia, made it back to Scotland. Now, this was super bad for Scotland, which had invested an awful lot of their capital into this venture. And the Lowland Scots and the company stockholders were furious and tried to recoup some of their losses with just regular trade, some privateering. But these were also horribly disastrous ventures and did not succeed. Ultimately, this was so damaging to Scotland that it probably led to the ultimate union with England. In 1707, the Acts of Union were passed. And these were two acts by which the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland, which at the time, again, were separate states with separate legislatures, would be united into one kingdom by the name of Great Britain. And importantly, Article 15 of the Acts of Union granted £400,000 sterling to Scotland, a sum known as the equivalent to sort of the wealth or debt of Scotland, to offset future liability towards the English national debt, which at the time was £18 million. But since Scotland itself had no national debt, most of the sum was used to compensate the investors in the Darien scheme, with something around 60% of the fund allocated to its shareholders and creditors. Now, there's a lot of talk among historians, among Englishmen and Scotsmen, about whether or not this was really just sort of like a big payoff. But a popular conception is that the Darien scheme caused Scotland to have to commit to the Acts of Union. It was its failure to remain independent, and that this was just a payoff so that Scotland would join with England. The poet Robert Burns was scathing about this, and he wrote, "We are bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." And it seems to me that this is true, that Scotland's economic fortunes, its fiscal fortunes, were so bad that the Acts of Union with England, which had kind of been an open question, was no longer an open question. There was no way to stay independent without joining with England. And as I was preparing for this lecture, I was expecting, if you were around for my my Roanoke talk, early colonization was often just a bunch of dumb decisions by dumb people that went really poorly. And so I was expecting that the Darien scheme was going to be more of that it was mostly just astonishingly bad decision-making. But it actually seems like the Scots did a pretty good job of supplying. They picked a decent place. And aside from colossal mismanagement, which definitely was bad decision-making, there was a lot that could have gone differently for this. And surprise, surprise, it seems to me like the fault for the failure of the Darien colony lies with England, of course, for sort of like maliciously abandoning them and refusing to help, providing no support whatsoever, and actively sabotaging the Scottish Darien Company. I don't know for sure, nobody can, whether or not it would have succeeded if it had had English support, but it seems probable that it would have. And history would be pretty different. I don't know how, what else might have happened, but it seems entirely possible that Panama might be a Scottish colony or a Scottish settled colony, or they might be speaking, Spanish with a Scottish dialect or something like that. And ultimately, it is what it is, and it's interesting because Scotland barely had any time to make anything happen, so it's all pure speculation. But as I was doing the research into this, it was really quite striking how, like, compared to Jamestown, compared to the Plymouth colony, how well supplied and supported, and how, again, somewhat well thought out it was. And if they had followed Paterson's plan, which was, again, to set up a trading port, not like a plantation, that this could have been a really financially successful venture. They could have had a very rich and prosperous port here on the Darien, the Isthmus of Darien. But it didn't happen. The Scots fucked it up, and they joined with England to form the country of Great Britain, which now is the United Kingdom, and looks like it may very well splinter again. So I'm not sure there's any big lesson here. I do hope that you're going to see a through line in all of the talk that I have about colonies. But I wanted to talk about the Darien scheme, and I hope you enjoyed it. I thought this was I think it's really interesting that this happened, and it's very well known in England. I think and in Scotland, of course. I think this is a pretty well-traveled part of history, but I don't think that most people outside of the Isles know about Scotland's attempt to colonize the United States, colonize the Americas. And I think it's really interesting. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all for tuning in. Cheers, Sláinte. I'll see you all next week. I'll be back with a talk about drawing the global color line. That's going to be a good one. Happy Friday, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and good question. Do they have to return the money if they're independent again? I have no idea. But now that you mention it, that might actually be something that they would have to do if Scotland declares independence. The financial wonkery involved with the Bank of England and with just sort of the whole financialization of that state is totally bizarre. I'm sure that there would be some sort of weird indemnity if Scotland decided to declare independence, but I have no idea what that would look like. Let's see. Things are looking pretty in favor of Scotland declaring independence and returning to the EU. So we'll see what happens there. But anyway, Scotland the brave, Scotland the free. Sláinte. Good night, everybody.